Hello, my name is Erin Davis. I'm a professor of sociology and core faculty in the Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies program at Cornell College. And today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about sexuality and fun home. And let me start by sharing my screen with you. Okay, so today I want to focus on the way sexuality is understood in fun home. And this links to this question of how do we know what we know or what we think we know. And also, Allison is really attempting, or Bechdel is attempting to some extent create a coherent narrative, but then also questions that narrative. So we'll look at that a little bit as well. And so let me talk a little bit about the outline of this short video this morning. First, I want to talk about this notion of erotic truth and think about this in the context of the social construction of sexuality, the way in which Bruce and Allison are presented in Fun Home in terms of their sexuality, and the concept of coming out and how that's discussed as well. I also want to refer you briefly to two other videos, one on inversion and one on identity construction, areas that are explored further in those videos and not touched as much upon in this one. And then briefly we'll end with a discussion of Bruce's death and how Allison presents that. So I'm going to start this presentation with the concept of erotic truth. This is a concept that's raised toward the end of the graphic novel. Is there an erotic truth of identity? Bechdel seems to both avow and disavow this concept. In Fun Home, Bechdel presents her father, Bruce, as a closeted gay man who lived a lie and whose life and death reflected this lie. Bechdel queries, I suppose a lifetime spent hiding one's erotic truth could have a culminating renunciatory effect. Sexual shame is in itself a kind of death. Yet she also includes letters and stories which complicate this narrative, providing limited insight into Bruce's own identity negotiation and the larger social and geographical context in which he does exert some agency over the choices made. Further, she concludes by questioning the very narrative presented. Erotic truth is a rather sweeping concept. I shouldn't pretend to know what my father was. Fun Home is equally a story about Allison's self-journey, built and understood in large part in comparison to her father's story. Bechdel writes, perhaps my eagerness to claim him as gay, in contrast to bisexual or some other category, is just a way of keeping him to myself, a sort of inverted Oedipal complex. And so let's talk a little bit about the social construction of sexuality. Sexuality is not always understood as a central component of one's identity. This is true both of some individuals who don't consider sexuality a central component of their identity, but there have also been historical times and other places where sexuality hasn't been as central to our understanding of who we are. So engaging in same-sex sexual activity does not always lead to individuals self-identifying or being identified as gay. And being gay is more than simply engaging in same-sex sexual practices. Identities are historically and culturally specific, and the translation of desire and sexual acts into sexual identities is a social and interpersonal process. Basically, individual acts are understood according to social frameworks, which govern our social and sexual behavior and identification, and also impact the way we organize our individual lives. If you reject the idea that identities are simply external expressions of core universal truths of the self, then questions of identity are political and social questions. How and why does someone come to identify or not identify in a particular way at a particular time? This raises the question of how we know what we know, or what we think we know. And in exploring Bruce's erotic truth, it might be less productive to ask, was Bruce gay or bisexual? As Allison herself notes, I shouldn't pretend to know what my father was. However, in Fun Home, we do get hints at Bruce's own thoughts on sexuality and identity through his letters. And we can explore how Allison understands her sexuality and her reasoning for why she wants to claim him as gay. If we look at sexuality in Fun Home, sexuality is first raised in this novel on page 15. As specific gendered sexuality, Allison refers to Butch and Nellie. As part of a series of opposition, Bechdel presents distinguishing Bruce and Allison. This distinguish contextually seems to focus more on gender, and then shifts to sexuality, as Bruce's same-sex sexual activities with teenage boys is first mentioned as just a short aside on page 17. Allison's sexual identity as a lesbian is not explicitly noted until page 58. Outside of a few early references, sexuality becomes a more central theme in chapter 3, which starts by noting, "My father's death was a queer business." This is then followed by Allison's coming out letter to her parents and a follow-up phone call with her mother that she describes as a doleful coming out, where she learns that her father has had affairs with young men and that, according to her mother, he was molested by a farmhand when he was young. As a partial aside, in a later scene with Bruce, this early experience is represented. Quote, "My first experience was when I was 14. He was real well built with black wavy hair. It was nice." This juxtaposition reflects the variations in how different characters interpret and represent experiences, as well as fluctuations into the extent to which sexuality among individuals at different ages is presented. Compare, for example, Helen's and Bruce's description of Bruce's first sexual experiences. The later scenes mentioning chicken hawks, which presents this age difference as more predatory. Bechdel's later description of the photograph of Roy as beautiful, or the avoidance of any mention of sexual impropriety in the courtroom. So this is just one place where you see different representations, different interpretations of sexuality. You also see differences, or there are differences, between Allison's coming out and Bruce's coming out. Bechdel clearly presents Allison as coming out at several points in the novel. She comes out to her parents when she writes a letter declaring, "I am a lesbian." She also writes that the first time she attends a meeting of the gay union feels like a public declaration. And in contrast, Bechdel refers to learning about her father's sexual experiences from her mother as a doleful coming out. But what does it mean to come out if one does not privately or publicly claim a particular identity? If we look at Bruce and Allison, Bruce's relationship to his sexuality and sexual identity in general is decidedly different from Allison's. In a phone call with her father after she declares herself a lesbian, Bruce comments, "Everyone should experiment." That's said on both page 77 and page 210. He follows up with, "Why do you have to put a label on yourself?" Rather than indicating that experimentation is a phase, which might be one interpretation, Bruce may understand his own sexuality in terms of continual exploration and experimentation. So in the letter he writes to Allison, which is on page 211 and 212, Bruce writes, "Helen seems to be just suggesting that you keep your options open. I tend to go along with that, but probably for different reasons. Of course, it seems like a cop-out. But who are cop-outs for? Taking sides is rather heroic, and I'm not a hero. What is it really worth?" There have been a few times where I thought I might have preferred to take a stand, but I never really considered it when I was young. In fact, I don't think I ever considered it until I was over 30. Let's face it, things do look different then. At 43, I find it hard to see advantages, even if I had done so when I was young. I admit I have been somewhat envious of the new freedom that appears on campuses today. In the 50s, it was not even considered an option. You know, I was never even in New York until I was about 20. But even seeing it then was not quite a revelation. There was not much in the village that I had not known in Beach Creek. In New York, you can see it and mention it. But elsewhere, it was not seen or mentioned. It was rather simple. This letter returns us to this concept of erotic truth. How do we know what we know, who knows, and why it matters, both to us and to others? Although different from Allison's possibilities, or the possibilities that exist today, Bruce was not unaware of the different possibilities for his life. Allison might argue that he is lying to everyone about his identity and hiding his behavior. But Bruce might view this differently. He does not claim a particular sexual identity, either privately or publicly. As noted in this letter, Bruce writes, "I never really considered it when I was young. In fact, I don't think I ever considered it until I was over 30. At 43, I find it hard to see the advantages, even if I had done so when I was young. And so while his current sexual practices might be kept publicly secret, Bruce's sexual history, while not known by his children, are known to his wife and possibly their New York friends, that are referenced on page 76 and 216. And this illustrates the imperfect dichotomy of being closeted or being out. The concepts being closeted and coming out are complicated, incomplete descriptions of how both Allison and Bruce lived their lives. So there's a lot to discuss in this letter, and I have a list of discussion questions here, and I'm going to pause for just a second. You might want to pause the video, take a look at these discussion questions, think about them individually, maybe discuss them in small groups or as a class. I will also recommend watching videos on inversion and on Allison's identity development and sexual identity development to provide even more depth into the exploration of sexuality in fun homes. Those are separate videos that are available. I want to conclude by talking a little bit about Bruce's death in the concept of this novel. Bechdel represents Bruce's death as queer business. And just as Bechdel poses her father as gay while questioning her ability to know her father's erotic truth, she poses her father's death as a suicide while also questioning the circumstances of his death. There are several chapters with both begin and end with a focus on her father's death. In chapter 2, it starts, "There is no proof that my father actually killed himself." But Bechdel states, "I don't believe it was an accident." She goes on to acknowledge it is possible that we choose to believe this because it is less painful. In chapter 3, which starts, "My father's death was a queer business," Bechdel juxtaposes Bruce's death with her coming out. "The idea that I caused his death by telling my parents I was a lesbian is perhaps illogical." While she entertains other possibilities beyond this link, she concludes the chapter noting, "I'm reluctant to let go of that last tenuous bond." And chapter 4 starts, "I have suggested that my father killed himself, but it's just as accurate to say that he died gardening. He crossed the road to toss some yard waste down the bank and then jumped back as if he had seen a snake in the road in front of a truck." And Bechdel writes, "And who knows, perhaps he did." So in conclusion, throughout Fun Home, Bechdel attempts to make sense of her father's sexuality and his death and to find a coherent narrative. In the final chapter, she writes, "When I try to project what my dad's life might have been had he not died in 1980, I don't get very far." She imagines his possible death in the early years of AIDS, while also noting, "Maybe I'm trying to render my senseless personal loss meaningful by linking it, however posthumously, to a more coherent narrative. A narrative of injustice, of sexual shame and fear, of life considered expendable. There's a certain emotional expedience to claiming him as a tragic victim of homophobia, but that is a problematic line of thought." So this leaves us with several questions. Why does Bechdel seek a more coherent narrative? Why is this narrative so difficult to construct? And again, back to the theme of the FYS, how do we know what we know, or how do we know what we think we know? So again, I'm going to leave you with a set of discussion questions. I'm going to stop here and give you time to pause to review these questions. Either again, individually, think about them, maybe talk about them in a small group, or talking about them with the full class. So thank you very much for watching.